From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. How are you doing today, David?
Great. Another great show this week.
We do have another great show, and we also have the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, everybody. It's a show that stretches from Richmond, California to Syria. So that's the nature of our global society.
That's correct. But just before we dive into the show, I want to give a shout out to another radio station that has joined our ever-growing network of affiliates. We are very pleased to welcome KTNF AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota. They are airing the Ralph Nader Radio Hour starting this Sunday, April 22nd at 7 a.m. and Monday, April 23rd, once at 6 a.m. and then again at 9 p.m. Central Standard Time, a triple shot of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thanks to station president Chad Larson, production manager Brett Johnson, and everyone over there at AM 950. Welcome aboard our first AM station, Ralph.
What a pleasure. I couldn't wait to be in the state of Minnesota, as they call it.
Yes. And as Ralph also mentioned, we do have a treat for you today because this is a good one to start off with, Minnesota. We have two excellent guests on the show, one covering domestic politics and the other foreign policy. On the domestic side, we have former Green Party Mayor of Richmond, California, Gayle McLaughlin, who in 8 years as mayor showed how real progressive policies can work for people. We'll get into more detail about that in a minute, because she's looking to scale up that vision by running for lieutenant governor of California as an independent. She has been endorsed by Our Revolution, the group that spun off the Bernie Sanders presidential campaign, and in that spirit is not taking corporate donations. We have a lot of listeners in California who should stay tuned for that. So if you don't know the story of Richmond, it's quite incredible what she and her team accomplished. And in the second half of the show, we will be talking about what is going on in Syria. I know I have really no idea what is going on in Syria, but with the tensions surrounding a recent missile strike, seems like I should start paying more attention. So on the show, we have probably the foremost expert on the Syrian political situation. His name is Joshua Landis, and he is the director of the Center for Middle East Studies and professor at the University of Oklahoma's College of International Studies. He'll be joining us to help us unpack that very overstuffed and complicated suitcase that is Syria. As usual, somewhere in the middle, our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber, will check in with his latest findings in the dark underworld of corporate malfeasance. And if we have time, we'll try to answer more listener questions. But first, let's have David introduce us to someone who has established herself as a bona fide progressive reformer.
Gayle McLaughlin is a former two-term mayor of Richmond, California. She's running for lieutenant governor of California as a progressive independent. Mayor McLaughlin was a Richmond City Council member for 2 terms and served as mayor from 2007 to 2014. While Mayor McLaughlin was mayor of Richmond, the city passed the first rent control law in California in 30 years, increased the minimum wage, reduced homicides by 75% in 8 years, forced Chevron to pay on average an additional $7.5 million in taxes per year, and sued Chevron for damage to the city's population. We're going to hear a little bit about Chevron. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Mayor Gayle McLaughlin.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
This is quite a story, listeners. It shows that in a city of 110,000 on the Pacific Bay, a majority of whom are Hispanics and African Americans. It's a city that was plagued by a lot of deprivations, unemployment, underemployment, street crime, police transgressions, the Chevron refinery pollution, and a few controlling the many. And along came a group of progressive citizens led by Gayle McLaughlin, who grew up in Chicago and got her college degrees in New England and decided in mid-career to drive out to California and decided to reside in Richmond itself. And this group of progressives transformed this city, a lot of problems still, but transformed this city in a way that we should all learn from in our communities, in our towns, in our cities, because it was done the way I have always suggested it be done. A small number of very active citizens, some of whom ran for city council and became mayor, like Gayle, and backed by scores of people who had regular jobs and volunteered a lot of their time and their energy in this sizable city to make these kinds of changes. They also, to add to what David just said, they did curb police misconduct, and they defended immigrants, and they went after this giant refinery, which had very few employees living in Richmond, but it was often producing fires and spills and underpaying its tax obligations given its size, and as well becoming a political heavyweight in the town hall. So let's start, Gayle, with what you faced when you started tippy-toeing into the politics of Richmond. And I do want to thank you because you were one of our volunteers on the 2000 presidential campaign in California. What did you think of this awesome task of turning a city around that was known in the whole San Francisco Bay Area as an extremely difficult city to survive in and to have a decent livelihood?
Yeah, so first of all, it's great to be here with you, Ralph. You know, it's a real honor, and always appreciated your work, your runs for president, and your ongoing work.
Thank you.
So valuable. So yes, we, in 2003, a group of us activists, as you say, a small group, got together. We were all doing various activist work in the city as well as anti-war work in terms of the Iraq War and other issues. And we realized that we weren't gaining the traction we needed in our city. You know, we would speak before the city council, and they would just listen and then vote in a completely different way than we expected them to vote. And so we realized that the whole city council was at that time, purchased by Chevron or intimidated by the oil giant. So we knew we had to become the leaders we were waiting for. And we needed people sitting at the dais, as well as ongoing community leaders outside of the city council. So we decided to form this alliance, which is called the Richmond Progressive Alliance. And it's a diverse, inclusive, year-round, progressive, corporate-free organization. And we came together regardless of party affiliation or no party affiliation. We were Progressive Democrats, some were of that registration. Others were Green Party members and Peace and Freedom Party members, and others had no party affiliation. But we came together on our progressive values. And we decided to run candidates for office without any corporate money. And I was one of the first two candidates that we ran in 2004, and I won. The other candidate narrowly missed, but that threw me into the realm of elected office when I had never really set my sights on that, but I wanted to do what was right, and, people needed somebody to stand up for the community in that role, so I was really
Let me just interrupt you. This is the first electoral breakthrough of the Richmond Progressive Alliance. Tell our listeners roughly how many active citizens were in the Richmond Progressive Alliance in a city of 110,000.
Yeah, so when we first started out, I often say that it wasn't long before we moved up to about 30, but it even started smaller than that. We started in someone's living room, and for quite a while, that's where we met, in a living room. And, we brought more people in and eventually had a chance to get some space in other people's office, like various social justice groups, and eventually, years later, got our own office.
But, Gayle, it never was more than 1,000 real activists, was it?
No. The core activists were in the hundreds, and, of course, our reach went further, but...
I'm making this point to our listeners because I constantly say if you have as little as 1% or less of the people rolling up their sleeves and really becoming activists, putting time in their community, and on changes that reflect majority opinion or majority rights, you can change things around, even with the giant neighboring Chevron refinery. So continue.
Yeah, so, you said it well. If we could do it in Richmond, with Chevron's millions thrown into our electoral field trying to defeat us, it can happen anywhere. So, yeah, so we were a small group and just, went out campaigning, knocking on doors and reaching people one-on-one, going to all the community events and raising money, small donations, lots of individuals, ready for change. Lots of people in Richmond had had enough. The city was spiraling downward. Our crime was way up, and our poverty level was not being addressed at all, and health problems weren't being addressed. Rent was high, and even early in the RPA, we were working to get rent control. It took us quite a long time to get there, but we really addressed the issues of the people. And we had a people's convention during that early time. We had forums where we really brought in lots of community members to speak to the issues of the people. And it just really hit home for people, and they loved the fact that we didn't take corporate money. They hadn't heard that before, most of them, and they were like, wow, you don't take corporate money? This is new. And I saw their eyes get wide, and I was proud to reach them and, recognizing that their values were actually the same as mine and our progressive values at large.
Steve Early reviewed your book, Winning Richmond, in the Los Angeles Progressive publication, and he has done a book on Richmond as well. We had him on the show. This is Richmond, California, 110,000 people, mostly lower income people, mostly minorities, Hispanics, and African Americans, Asian Americans. We have a huge story to tell here, listeners, but just to focus it, you took on your group, Richmond Progressive Alliance. You took on big oil, big soda, and big banks. So let's start with the Chevron presence in Richmond and then go to your big soda battle, and you're challenging the big banks along with the landlord lobby.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so Chevron, of course, was a big focus for us early on in the campaign. And we, made sure that we let the residents know that Chevron should be paying more in taxes and they should be regulated for their pollution that had harmed our community for over 100 years. And all the accidents, and, they're called accidents, but they're really willful neglect in terms of maintaining the refinery and how that impacted the safety of our residents. So we really pushed hard against Chevron, and we eventually got a settlement from them. We put ballot measures on. In 2008, we had a ballot measure that would have taxed Chevron something like $10 million additional dollars each year, which passed. The voters passed it. Chevron took the city to court and found a technical problem with it, but Chevron knew we were going to go back to the ballot with a new measure that fixed the issue and still bring forward better taxation policy, and the residents were with us. So instead, they came to the table and negotiated a settlement for over $100 million in additional taxes over the course of 15 years, which, as David may have said, was like $7.5 million in additional taxes a year. So that was one thing we did. We pushed back on them for their pollution and limited their pollution. We stopped a really harmful project that they were putting forward that would have refined heavier, dirtier crude. The majority at that time, which we called the Chevron 5, because they were the majority of the council. I was mayor at the time, and I was in the minority who voted against this project. But it passed, but the environmental groups brought it to court and won.
In this process, you had some demonstrations and peaceful marches, didn't you?
Absolutely. We often, and still do, march to the refinery. There's been some nonviolent civil disobedience, sit-downs in front of the refinery. But we had an amazing march in 2013, which was a year after a major fire. In 2012, there was a major fire that actually sent 15,000 local residents to local hospitals for treatment for respiratory problems and eye issues and nose issues, just really harsh issues that were impacting their respiratory system.
This was a Chevron refinery fire, a Chevron fire.
That's right. It was a Chevron refinery fire. And they were actually fined for willful neglect. They were convicted of willful neglect, for which they put forward a statement of, no contest or guilty or something that they couldn't defend themselves. But a year later, we had a march to the refinery of 3,000 people. So, that was a lot of people in our streets and people from all over the Bay Area. And actually, there were some people from, outside of the country as well. So Richmond has become sort of a center for environmental justice. People recognized the work that we were doing in the Richmond Progressive Alliance, and they were definitely on board with us. And we also sued Chevron in court for that 2012 fire. The city is still in court fighting that. And hopefully the current city council members will get a good settlement or take it to trial. We really need them to make safety the top priority rather than their profits.
Yeah, there's much more about the Chevron pressure on Richmond in your book, Winning Richmond, How a Progressive Alliance Won City Hall by Gayle McLaughlin. Anybody who's in a town and city and wants to turn that around, you can't ignore this book. It's a tremendously motivating book, but it shows exactly how a few progressive activists representing majority opinion and having the right direction for their community can even challenge someone as gigantic as the Chevron Oil Company. You also started something called Solar Richmond, emphasizing the green economy. We'll get to that in a minute, but can you quickly, Gayle McLaughlin, go through the challenges to big soda and big banks?
Yes. So first of all, let me just say one more sentence about Chevron. They spent millions to try and defeat us, and we were able to overcome their millions. In 2014, they spent $3.5 billion in a city, a mid-sized city like Richmond was unprecedented, and all the progressives won and all the Chevron candidates lost.
It shows you that big money can be defeated by determined voters that nullify the money. They put $3.5 million to defeat you in this city of 110,000 people. Imagine, and they lost. So there's a lot more in your book, but, for interest of time, we want to move to big soda, big banks, and then Solar Richmond.
Right. So let me share a little bit about the big soda campaign. So unfortunately, that was one ballot measure, 1 year that we didn't have the success. Every election year, the Richmond Progressive Alliance had either one or more successes since 2004. Now, in 2012, we ran a soda tax measure, a sugary beverage tax measure, and we also ran two candidates who were aligned with the soda tax. And Big Soda came into the city and just, pounded away with misinformation. They actually tried to say that we were trying to tax the poor because we didn't want them. We wanted to tax their soda. And, we made it clear, we tried to, that, this was a small amount of tax, a half cent on an ounce of soda as sugary beverages. And that money would be going to youth projects and nutrition projects and recreation projects. We were going to build soccer fields and, baseball fields and such. But they successfully, the soda company spent, I think it was $2 million or close to that, or even maybe more, to defeat successfully and split the community. It was one of those wedge issues, and we, the progressives, were on the right side, in terms of our values, wanting to overcome the childhood obesity issues that low-income families have and that our American population has, and sugary beverages being one of the biggest offenders. And so they split the community from the progressives and those that, bought into what the soda companies were saying, that they're trying to tax the poor and not give you a right to buy your soda. And we said, soda in moderation is fine, but we think maybe a little extra tax will be something that maybe deters that everyday soda drinking day in and day out that harms our community. So they succeeded in defeating that. And since our candidates were aligned with that measure, our candidates also lost. But it didn't stop us. We regrouped right after that campaign, and actually it made the Richmond Progressive Alliance stronger because we looked at, what we could have done better and, how we could motivate and move the community in a healthier direction, even without that ballot measure. And it was an educational campaign. So I think it had that benefit at large, as well as it motivated other cities like San Francisco and Berkeley. And actually, Mexico put forward and passed a soda tax. And Richmond, led the way. So even though we didn't win, and we hope someday to have it back on the ballot and win then.
Well, you showed civic resilience, replacing discouragement and withdrawal. So it was a good lesson. How about the big banks?
Okay, so the big banks, we all know there was a big foreclosure. The housing crisis continues, but the big mortgage crisis started in around 2007, 2008, and Richmond was hit very hard. Over 50% of the mortgages in Richmond were underwater, meaning that the mortgage was far more than the current value of the homes. And the big banks were not doing anything. They were not modifying the mortgages, and economists everywhere were saying, if you reduce the principals on these mortgages, that will help the housing crisis. It went across political parties and such. Economists were agreeing that was the way to go. And the big banks were giving all kinds of excuses. So we said, big banks, if you won't or can't reduce these principles to help our homeowners stay in their homes and not be foreclosed upon, sell these mortgages to us, the city, and we will reduce the principal. And it will give you a fair value for the price. Fair value meaning the fair current value, not the inflated value of the mortgage. And if you won't do it voluntarily, if you won't sell it to us voluntarily, we'll acquire it through our city power of eminent domain.
That got national coverage.
It did. It was really an innovative program. People loved it. People saw it as a really important way for local elected officials to help their community, and I was proud to champion that. And we went through that for a good 2 years, and we had the votes on the city council. We tried to get other cities to join us, and many, like you said, many news stations and papers picked it up. And Wall Street was really, really afraid, and they did everything they could to stop it, trying to talk to other Richmond council people and other cities' council people who were considering it. And unfortunately, what happened, and this is an example of why corporate-controlled elected officials are so problematic, they went to Congress. Wall Street lobbyists went to Congress, which we know has lots of corporate-controlled officials, and they pressured them, and Congress put forward a bill at the end of 2014 that said any public entity that acquires a mortgage by eminent domain will not get government insurance. And that was the insurance. We were going to, you have to insure the mortgages, and we were going to use FHA insurance. And, that bill went forward, passed, and so it stopped us. But we did put enough pressure on the big banks and Wall Street so that they did voluntarily reduce some of the principles. So in that regard, it was successful, and also it was a great education and mobilizing effort for communities everywhere.
You've taken a strong stand as city council on foreign issues, for example. You've mobilized around a number of resolutions. You took a critical stance on the Patriot Act during the George W. Bush presidency, spoke out against the occupation war in Iraq, called for non-intervention in Iran. You yourself have connected with the Mondragón cooperative in Spain that has manufacturing and retail outlets selling over $13 billion of euros a year, a real great example of production and consumer cooperatives. You've supported the embattled people in Gaza. You've been to Cuba. But the vast amount of your time has been spent in Richmond, California, which is how many miles from San Francisco?
We're right across the bay. Richmond has 32 miles of bay shoreline, more than any other city on the San Francisco Bay. And if you stand on our bay trail along the shoreline, you see San Francisco right across the bay. I'm not sure how many miles it's without, being in rush hour. It's, you could get there sometimes less than a half an hour, sometimes 20 minutes.
The reason why I'm asking is I wondered what kind of local and regional media did you get in terms of coverage, San Francisco, Oakland media, and your local media? Because I'm sure our listeners are saying, well, you must have had some support from the media.
Well, of course, I think the Bay Area in general has come to know Richmond as a city that has transformed itself. And over the years, we did get a lot of press, especially as we started reducing crime, reducing homicides 75%. The press picked that up and lots of interviews. And, you mentioned these foreign kind of inroads or connections that we made from the local level. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I put this in the book, how 90%, 95%, 98% of our work was local. But, there was 1%, maybe it was just 1% of the time that we would spend was connecting with the global community and the global struggles. I think that's important because, we are a global family. I would put that out. There was often resistance from the Chevron-controlled council members, and, I went to Ecuador to visit the rainforest and contamination by Chevron of the rainforest, and Chevron, absolutely hated that. But we did it, and we want to build that solidarity between communities here and communities in other parts. Those struggles connect.
You also worked at the state level, and now you're running for lieutenant governor on Medicare for All, a free college California. That's the Bernie Sanders tuition-free college or university education. You want to reform the notorious Proposition 13, which has drained key money for educational institutions and schools in California, needs amendment. You're opposed to Jerry Brown's, the governor's support of fracking. You want an oil severance tax. You want to aid California cities for sustainable development, affordable housing, and campaign finance reform. You must be opposed to the top two. And, people not in California should know that there was a unfortunate referendum based on misleading information that passed in California saying that in the primaries, only the top two vote getters can go to the November election, which is a terrible way of knocking out competitive candidates, third-party candidates. They can't go to November. That's being challenged on constitutional grounds in the federal courts at the present time. But tell us a bit about the state Medicare for All. People should know that the California legislature passed Medicare for All when Governor Schwarzenegger was governor, knowing that he would veto it. Now that Governor Jerry Brown is there, this bill, Health Insurance for All, passed the state Senate, but is being blocked by the leader of the Assembly. And can you comment on that and what you're finding around the state of California on that issue?
Yes. Again, it's another example of corporate-funded elected officials. We have a bill here in California called SB 562, the Healthy California Act, which is single-payer Medicare for all, a complete coverage for everyone in California. And it went to the Assembly to be discussed, and the Speaker of the Assembly, Anthony Rendon, proceeded to shelve it without even discussing it on the floor. And this is what's wrong. Rendon is financed by insurance companies and big pharma, and to not even give, so many people have galvanized around this measure. It is very popular. It is, I would say, the most popular issue in California. And the fact that it didn't even get a hearing on the floor is outrageous. And so people have organized, and there's a great candidate running against Rendon, taking no corporate money for the primary and the November election, hopefully. But the fact that these corporate-funded elected officials, they come up with excuses, that they say, there wasn't enough, no financial program was outlined, and there was, perhaps they wanted more outline of the finances, and that could have been discussed. There's been a lot of research on how to finance, get it off the ground. Of course, we know single-payer Medicare for All is going to be cheaper in the long run for everyone. So that was really outrageous, but we're still pushing forward. And, we think California eventually, we hope we can get this passed and set an example for the rest of the country.
Imagine if a tiny number of people in cities around the country formed their own progressive alliance. And a lot of this alliance work in Richmond, it had conservatives and liberals. They want to breathe clean air. They want fair taxation. They would like solar energy. Just imagine what would happen in the country. That's why this book is so important that Gayle has written, Winning Richmond, How a Progressive Alliance Won City Hall, and how you can win City Hall all around the country. Gayle is spelled Gayle, and if you want to get more information, go to gayleforcalifornia.org, Gayle for California.org. Well, we're running out of time, but I do want you to talk just briefly about the Solar Richmond project, which kind of is the way to go in terms of jobs and retrofitting and solar panels at the local level, instead of this crazy casino that's being proposed for one of the most beautiful bay areas of Richmond, California, beautiful Point Melati.
Yes. So first of all, the Point Melati casino was defeated. That was another big struggle. There's still ongoing struggles about what will go there, but we did defeat the casino. Urban casinos are not good for the community, especially a community with poverty, because people will gamble away their little money. And also it produces crime and such. But Solar Richmond, to get on that, this was a wonderful organization that I was proud to co-found, and it educated people about solar and eventually became a nonprofit with the partners who co-founded it with me, became the director, and it contracted with the city for solar installation job training. And as a result of that, Richmond became number one in the Bay Area in 2010 for solar installed per capita. So it shows that, when you organize and mobilize, you actually can turn things around and become number one on these issues. And on the Progressive Alliance issue, we are encouraging other progressive alliances all over the state. And over the last year in California, based on the Richmond Progressive Alliance model, 10 new progressive alliances have emerged. So I'm very, very delighted to say that things are happening, and Richmond has kind of spurred things forward, although each group has their own autonomy, of course, but it's kind of spreading, and that's what we want.
Okay, the book is Winning Richmond, How a Progressive Alliance Won City Hall. It really is an engrossing book, almost 300 pages, written very clearly by Gayle McLaughlin. And on the back of this paperback, published by hardballpress.com, that's a nice name, hardballpress.com, on the back is a color picture of you and Bernie Sanders. And has Bernie Sanders come out supporting you?
Well, Bernie Sanders endorsed me personally in my campaign in 2014. He came to Richmond, and I'm running a campaign for lieutenant governor, and his organization, Our Revolution, national organization, has endorsed me as well. So I'm very, very proud to have so many progressive groups up and down California endorsing me. And organizing is the purpose of this campaign, to bring people together.
Well, thank you very much for your great accomplishments, and more to come, Gayle McLaughlin. The Richmond Progressive Alliance is a lesson to all of us, all over the country. Small number of people reflecting majority opinion at the local level, making tremendous changes in the face of a giant Chevron refinery and its political clout in that city over the years. Thank you very much, Gayle.
Thank you, Ralph. I really, really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
We've been speaking to independent candidate for California Lieutenant Governor Gayle McLaughlin. We will link to her website and her book, Winning Richmond, How a Progressive Alliance Won City Hall, at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Now we're going to step away for just 1 minute and go to the National Press Building in Washington, D.C. to hear from our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. You are listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Back after this.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Wednesday, April 18, 2018. I'm Russell Mokhiber. When people in power in the United States talk about corruption, they often focus on corruption overseas. Corruption overseas is usually hard corruption, bribes, kickbacks, and public theft. But then there is what is called soft corruption. That's corruption American style. Legalized bribery, corporate money flowing into the political system, the revolving door, lobbyists, consultants, gifts, travel. People in power don't like to talk about corruption in the United States because often they are the beneficiaries of it. But at the grassroots, corruption is a powerful political issue. It arguably was the issue that elected Barack Obama and elected Donald Trump. That's the take of Bill Curry. Corruption is this great hidden tsunami of an issue, Curry told Corporate Crime Reporter in an interview last week. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Now let's find out what is going on in that place called Syria. David?
Joshua Landis is director of the Center for Middle East Studies and professor at the University of Oklahoma's College of International Studies. He writes Syria Comment, a daily newsletter on Syrian politics that attracts over 100,000 readers a month. Dr. Landis travels frequently to Washington, D.C. to consult with government agencies and speak at think tanks. He has lived for over 14 years in the Middle East and speaks Arabic and French fluently. He has lived for 4 years in Syria and spent most summers in Damascus until the revolution began. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Professor Joshua Landis.
Well, it's a pleasure being with you.
Yeah, welcome indeed, Professor Landis. For those of you who are not familiar with his compilation of information, he's often the go-to person for a lot of the intelligent media around the country regarding the situation in Syria. Let's start with just a brief description, first of all, of the geography and population of Syria and how this situation, which is tragic on so many fronts, started in 2011.
Well, Syria is surrounded. It's a part of the Levant, and it's a part of the Middle East, which used to be ruled by the Ottoman Empire for hundreds of years before it was destroyed in 1918 during the First World War. And then Britain and France created a bunch of different countries: Iraq, Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, so forth. This part of the Ottoman Empire is a multi-ethnic, multi-religious part. Like Iraq, where you have Kurds, Sunnis, and Shiites. In Syria, you have really a Noah's Ark. There are two of just about everybody in Syria. For our purposes, the minority, the religious minority that's particularly interesting are the Alawites, because Bashar al-Assad and his father Hafez al-Assad, who've ruled Syria for almost 50 years, come from the Alawite minority. They're a heterodox Shiite minority that the majority Sunni Muslims, about 70% of the population of Syria are Sunni Arabs, don't regard as really Muslims. And this has caused a deep problem. The various religious and ethnic differences in Syria have come full center in this uprising. And there are other problems. A very narrow, oppressive dictatorship under the Ba'ath Party, a one-party state, for the last 50 years. And people in 2011 rose up demanding reform, freedom. It's only demanded democracy. But that was not one of the demands that the demonstrators asked for in the beginning, in part because there were many different aspirations that demonstrators were demanding. Some wanted an Islamic country ruled by Sharia law. Others wanted democracy. Others just wanted freedom. The Kurds wanted a state in the north, or a large degree of autonomy in the north of Syria. They're an ethnic minority, about 10% of Syria. So there were many different aspirations. The Assad regime, which has been holding to power and is dominated by the Alawite minority sect, at least in the military and the security agencies, really tried to shut down these demonstrations and began to shoot fairly early on. The opposition became violent, and many militias sprung up in Syria. This turned into the bloody civil war that we see today. And outside powers began to jump in because Syria is so centrally located. North of Israel, south of Turkey. It has a border with Iraq, with Jordan, with Lebanon. So it's right smack dab in the middle of the Middle East. And the larger Shiite Sunni struggle that separates Iran from Saudi Arabia, the bigger struggle between Russia and the United States, and also with Turkey, which wants to be a major Middle Eastern power today. So all of the countries jumped in, including Israel, and it's turned it into a royal mess today, where the Assad regime is ascendant once again, but only after 7 years of struggle with lots of foreign powers.
There has been a tremendous civilian casualty toll. Usually you see the figures, 500,000 people have died. Of course, many of those include soldiers, not just civilians. fighters, but it's a huge toll in a country that began in 2011 to be counted in terms of their census at about 28, 29 million people, I gather. Just for perspective, civil wars are unusually brutal. Our Civil War, which occurred in the 1860s, according to the most recent historian estimates, took 700,000 lives, and we had about the same level of population as Syria has now, maybe 2-3 million more people in our country. So civil wars are unusually brutal, and this one is almost a tunnel without a light at the end. How in the world can the United States, either just getting out of the whole scene completely, or if it's going to stay in to fight the remnants of ISIS, as President Trump keeps saying, how is the United States going to proceed here, not only in its own self-interest, but in the interest of peace and stability in the Middle East and the safety of the Syrian people, millions of whom have left Syria as desperate fleeing refugees?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, and it's being debated inside the Trump administration today. President Trump said we need to get out of Syria after we defeat ISIS, and that's soon. Many other policymakers around him are saying, no, we can't do that. We have to stay in Syria for the long haul. And in part, that's because they make several different claims for why we should stay. The first is that we have to make sure that ISIS doesn't come back. And second, to help the Kurds and other peoples in the north of Syria, where the United States today has special forces there and dominates an area about 30% of the Syrian landmass in northern Syria. That's where most of the Kurds live. And they helped us destroy ISIS. So many people argue that we should help the Kurds build an autonomous region or little statelet that would protect them from the Assad government. And thirdly, a bigger argument is made that the United States should roll back Iranian influence because Iran is a major supporter of the Assad regime. And this is largely in order to help Israel and Saudi Arabia, both of whom fear Iran and would like the United States to really contain Iran so that it doesn't compete with them for influence in the region. So those are the three major demands: ISIS, Kurds, roll back Iran. The problem with northern Syria is that it's the poorest part of Syria. Many of the major cities like Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor have been completely flattened by bombing. It needs tremendous reconstruction. And in this area that America took, there are lots of Kurds, about 2.5 million Kurds, but there are also lots of Arab tribesmen, some of whom worked with ISIS or Al-Qaeda and others who don't like the Kurds. So America is sitting on top of an ethnic cauldron there, very hard to manage. Of course, Americans talk about power sharing and developing a democratic. This is going to be very difficult to do. It could be done, but it would take 20, 30 years of money and effort. And that's the problem. I don't think most Americans have the stomach for that.
Yeah, further complicating the situation is that the support for the Assad rulers, the present dictator and his father, came in this country from people who supported both rulers because they protected Christians and other minorities. And now Christians are in great danger and they're fleeing for their lives. Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. And this is a very important aspect that doesn't get very much coverage in the U.S. press, which is that many Syrians look to Assad regime as a protector. And this is particularly true not only for the 12% of Syrians that are Alawites, but also Christians who, following World War II, were about 15% of the Syrian population. Today, they've fallen to 5% or so. But there are also Druze, about 3%, Ismailis, and other minorities. Even the Kurds have allied with the Assad regime against Islamist rebels in the region. So it's a very complex Noah's Ark, if you will, but many people look to the Assad regime, and also wealthy Sunni Arabs have not abandoned the regime. The army didn't fall apart, and most of the businessmen, whom America thought would abandon the regime if they put sanctions on them, have not, because they don't want to be wiped out and want to send their kids to school. And they didn't believe that the rebellion was going in the right direction and that they didn't want Islamist groups to take over. And we saw the rise of important Islamist groups on the side of the rebels, whether it was Al-Qaeda or ISIS or Ahrar al-Sham, many other groups that got backing from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states that wanted Sharia law to reign supreme in Syria, and we're not on the side of democracy. So this split the country along religious lines, and the Christians looked to Assad for support. They felt that they were going to be driven out of the country. And if we look at what's happened to Christians right across the Middle East with the rise of Islamist governments, they've been leaving in droves. Syria's gone from 15 to 5%, but in Israel, Palestine, there are almost no more Christians. In Egypt, the Coptic Christians have gone from almost 15% down to 7 or 8. Christians and other minorities, religious minorities, have been fleeing the Middle East in droves. This is a real problem. And the minorities in Syria have fought so bitterly to keep the regime in power precisely because they're worried that they'll be driven from the country if the rebels win.
In all the turmoil historically over 2,000 years of Mongol raids and wars ravaging that area, there's never been an exodus of Christian refugees as there has been in the last 10 years or so. This is a real tragedy. These people were rooted for hundreds and hundreds of years in their community. The topic in the news now is the chemical warfare. And this has puzzled a lot of people in this country because it's not clear what interest the Assad regime has in chemical warfare, since it knows that it brings the ire of Western powers on it, and they have plenty of weaponry to replace that. There's also a suspicion that the opponents to Assad are engaging in this warfare, chemical warfare, in order to embarrass Assad and put him in jeopardy to more U.S. strikes. And we have this latest attack where the UN team is trying to get access in order to get samples from the patients to determine what kind of gas and where it came from. And then we have the reputable reporter, Robert Fisk, in the Independent newspaper in England, who's gone to Douma, the area of where the attack was, and interviewed doctors and patients claiming that it wasn't a chemical attack, that what it was what one doctor called hypoxia. In other words, he saw people beginning to arrive at the hospital. At the time, there was wind and huge dust clouds coming into the basements and cellars where they lived, producing serious oxygen loss. And these people were, in his words, suffering from hypoxia and started throwing water over each other. And the question is, was it hypoxia or was it gas poisoning? Now, we live in a modern age of surveillance and technology and all kinds of information flows. Why in the world, over the last 7 years, has this issue of who used chemical warfare and who didn't not been settled? And what's your opinion on this, Professor Landis?
Well, this is a very vexed question. And the problem is, it doesn't make sense for Assad to use this weapon from the point of view of foreign powers, who the one red line that the United States has maintained in Syria is that Obama put forward, which is if you use chemical weapons, we're going to act. And he did act in 2013. He got out over 1,000 tons of chemical agents from Syria, which were then burnt aboard American ships. And he followed this up, and Trump followed it up with an attack at Khan Sheikhoun over a year ago. And there has been low-grade chemical weapon use since then, multiple times, mostly chlorine gas, which has not elicited much American reaction because chlorine is so widely used to purify water and medical. But the gas is toxic, and if it goes into a basement or some closed area, it can kill quite a few people. And the problem is it's been used a number of times. Each time it gets used, the regime says, this is rebel forces, which we know have some of it, who have used it, and back and forth we go. The only logical reason for Assad to use this kind of a weapon is because his military has been very severely degraded. He has tremendously hard time getting new troops. His generals don't want to send troops into these urban areas like Duma, where they're going to get killed in big numbers. And so in this sense, people want to win, which is, of course, and the problem with weapons of mass destruction and chemical weapons is they've been proven to be very successful in the past. The United States won World War II, first by using, of course, napalm on Tokyo, which is the single largest day of death in modern warfare, killing 40,000 people in Tokyo. But then, of course, when the Japanese didn't surrender, the atom bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, both of which killed about 100,000 people. And then, of course, in North Korea, in Korea, in the war with Korea, napalm was used very liberally. And in fact, Churchill in 1953 said it was barbaric that the Americans were using. He said Americans were slashing it about. And of course, we used it a lot in Vietnam, about 20 million tons of napalm and Agent Orange in Vietnam, because it worked. It didn't work well enough in Vietnam, but this is the problem. Militaries that want to win will use whatever weapon they can that they think will serve them. And that's the logic for thinking Assad may have used it. But of course, the rebels were in a terrible situation themselves, and they would want to set up a false flag operation. So we have this on both sides in a terrible end of a civil war where all sides are completely exhausted and their backs are against the wall.
Well, maybe we'll know when the UN team conducts its tests and its investigation and reports back publicly. Well, we've reached the end of our time, Professor Joshua Landis. Can you tell our listeners how they can access your information website for more deliberative information about what's going on over there?
With great pleasure. If you just look up Joshua Landis on Google, it'll be the first thing that comes up, and there'll be Syria Comment, my blog and newsletter, that will be right there with my name. So it's been a pleasure talking with you. You've always been one of my heroes, and I love to put my seatbelt on every time I get in my car.
Well, thank you very much. And for those of you who want to keep current on things in the Middle East, you can't do better than going to Professor Joshua Landis' informative website. Obviously, this is a subject that lends itself to the phrase "to be continued," but the overall theme I think that we have to talk about is why, for over 100 years, have Britain, France, the U.S. been in their backyards, overthrowing regimes, propping dictators up who repress their people, shenanigans with the oil industry, supporting uncritically Israeli military policy. What are we doing over there in their backyards? And if we don't answer that question the way our founding fathers suggested, avoiding entanglements overseas, the blowback, to use a CIA phrase, the boomerang back into this country in the form of explosions and disasters are not going to be long in coming. Thank you very much, Professor Landis.
Pleasure.
Thanks, Professor Landis. If you have one quick moment, can I ask you one more question?
Sure.
If you were advising President Trump about Syria, what would your policy prescription be?
Well, I think Trump is on the right. I agree with him that we need to get out of Syria. We have obligations that we have to see pursued. One is to make sure who've helped us tremendously and who've been persecuted in the past get a good deal. And I think that America can achieve that without building a nation for the Kurds, which would be terribly difficult in northern Syria, where Turkey doesn't want it, the Syrian regime doesn't want it, Iran doesn't want it, and Iraq doesn't want it. So Assad and the Kurds have worked together in the past. He has every reason to make a good deal with them. Tons of oil in the north under Kurdish control. They can get a much better share than they have in the past if America uses its leverage and diplomacy to work that out. And by leaving, but saying you have to give this good deal to the Kurds, I think Assad would make that deal because he wants to get rid of America. America still has tremendous air power in the region and can discipline the Assad regime if it doesn't uphold its bargain. Secondly, we've largely lost in Syria. Russia and Iran have been much more dedicated to their side of this conflict than the United States has. They have largely destroyed the rebel uprising in Syria, an American zone in the north with the Kurds, a Turkish zone, which is getting bigger, and the Turks are spreading out in northwestern Syria. And then Assad controls about 65% of the rest. This situation, America does not want to get caught staying in Syria for 20 years and trying to build a separate government in northern Syria. And we can't afford it. So we have to get out. And I think that Trump's instinct, whether it's for the right reasons or not, is a good one, which is not to get us stuck in Syria. I think Israel is a major concern. Will Israel be defended? Will Iran hurt Israel? And I think that Israel can take care of itself. Iran is not that strong. It has tons of economic problems. It's got to try to stabilize Assad and this regime that has helped win. I don't believe it can afford to go to war against Israel. And Israel has been drawing red lines. It's bombed Syria over 100 times, we believe, in the past 7 years. It's destroyed most of Syria's advanced weaponry. So I think that we can help Israel to defend itself without building a country in northern Syria.
Okay, that's very interesting. Yeah, and I don't think that's a point of view we hear. And I'm not sure that President Trump's going to be getting that kind of advice from John Bolton.
No, I don't think that's the kind of advice he's going to be getting. But I think that Mattis, others, although they've already stayed to make sure that ISIS is defeated, which is important, but I don't think they want to get sucked in either. And we're hearing more people stand up and say, maybe we can't do that much. And, Syria's got to rebuild. America's not going to rebuild it. Russia and Iran are going to have a very difficult time trying to rebuild Syria. I don't believe that it's in America's interest to linger in Syria more than a year or two.
Well, very good. I want to thank our guests again today, Gayle McLaughlin, independent candidate for California Lieutenant Governor, and Professor Joshua Landis, expert on Syria. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for bonus material we call The Wrap-Up.
Join us next week when we find out the truth about airlines with Consumer Reports travel journalist William McGee. And we also check in with Robert Weissman, the president of Public Citizen, and that organization's relentless fight to keep the Trump administration from completely handing the government over to corporate America. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, Jimmy, Steve, David, and for all you listeners, try to get more people informed about what's coming up in the November elections.
Hi, this is Jimmy Lee Wirt, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Welcome to the wrap-up. In this first part, Ralph gives us his take on a couple of items in the news.
In all the news about the Russians hacking our election process and interfering with our elections, I wonder to what extent we are also at the same time hacking them. Dictatorships and authoritarian regimes never want to admit that they've been hacked by foreign powers because it tends to display a weakness in front of their people. But it's interesting, we invented a lot of this software and surveillance technology, and the media never talks about what are we doing in retaliation or initiation in Russian politics. We have a record since World War II of interfering in a lot of elections in dozens of countries around the world, not to mention overthrowing democratically elected regimes such as in Iran and Guatemala. So that's something that's quizzical about the present discussion. The other thing is I saw an article on Yemen in the New York Times that the breakdown in the health care system is so severe that the infections are spreading and the Yemeni people are going to pharmacies and buying antibiotics. Almost 80% of them are taking antibiotics, leading to drug-resistant diseases of ravaging cholera, typhoid, and the article said that's one reason we should be very concerned about U.S. military support Saudi Arabia attacking Yemen, because these microbes can spread all over the world in drug-resistant form and come back to haunt us, as well as other Western countries. So that's just 2 points on the local news I thought I'd comment on.
Yeah, that's some blowback. And didn't Ted Koppel, in terms of your first point, didn't Ted Koppel tell us about a year and a half ago that we have sort of this form of digital mutual assured destruction. They're into our grid. We're into their grid. We all know it. We've all hacked each other, and it's a standoff there.
Yeah, and it's hardly being discussed. There's no initiation of international treaties on cybersecurity and preventing cyber warfare. Yeah, I mean, we can shut down their whole electrical system. They can shut down our electrical system. Ted Koppel wrote this book. It sold about 100,000 copies, and now it's a memory. And he doesn't know what to do to wake up the country and the government on this. We have chemical and biological warfare treaties. We have nuclear arms treaties. We need a leadership position by the U.S. initiating treaties dealing with cyber warfare.
And then the other issue is who's hacked our electoral system worse, the Russians or the Republican Party, by not allowing felons to vote. I mean, something like 1 out of 4 African-American men in Florida can't vote because they have a prison record.
Yeah.
Then Ralph answers a listener question.
Now I think we have time for a listener question. David, why don't you do the honors?
Well, we had Mayor McLaughlin on the show, who acts locally. Bridget Duffy writes that she's acting locally. She's running for state assembly in the 22nd District of California. And she says, Ralph, here in California, there's a universal health care bill waiting for a vote in the assembly. The Speaker Randon is refusing to allow it to go to vote, even though it did pass in the Senate. I would like to see a People's Action Force that's to a vote now. I think if we could gather some citizens outside Randon's personal residence and have silent vigils, we could accomplish this. How do I get this idea off the ground? Do you have any connections that can help or any other leverage you can lend?
Yes, there's a group in Southern California. It's fairly well known, called Consumer Watchdog, directed by Jamie Court, C-O-U-R-T. It's in Santa Monica. They're very much into full health care for the people of California. They've run referendums on other subjects, so they would be pleased to hear from you. And there is a single-payer group in the San Francisco Bay Area, and it has a newsletter, and you can probably find out about it by going to the website singlepayeraction.org. That's singlepayeraction.org, which is an information resource for people with your proposals.
And that's exactly what Gayle McLaughlin was talking about in the early part of the show, about Rendon's blocking of the single-payer bill.
Well, it's election year. It should be a major election issue. So go for it, Miss Duffy.
And that's a wrap. Thanks for listening.